The rain was pouring that night, turning the streets of Harlem into rivers of reflection as Bumpy Johnson walked through the shadowed alleys. The city that had once seemed to pulse with his every decision now felt different. Tension crackled in the air like static before a storm. He could feel it in his bones, the shifting of allegiances, the signs that told him something was about to break. In the distance, the low hum of cars could be heard, their headlights cutting through the misty night. But for Bumpy, the city felt unusually silent. Something was changing. It had been weeks since the whispers began, a rumor that the Italian Mafia was eyeing Harlem. They had always wanted in, but this time, the rumors felt like more than just talk. And when one of his own men, a trusted lieutenant named Tony, walked into the room with a grave look on his face, Bumpy knew. The Italians weren't just knocking on the door anymore. They were making their move. "Bumpy," Tony said, his voice uncharacteristically somber. "It's them. They've started making deals with the boys on the lower end. They're buying off key men in your crews, trying to pull them away from you." The words hit like a slap. Betrayal. It wasn't just the threat of another power rising in Harlem. It was his own men, the ones who'd sworn loyalty, being swayed by the promise of something bigger, something from outside Harlem's gritty borders. The Italian Mafia had always been the shadow looming over his empire, but now that shadow was creeping into the heart of his turf. And Bumpy Johnson wasn't the kind of man to let anyone, especially an outsider, take what was his. His jaw clenched. "Get the others. We're taking this to the streets." Bumpy knew it wasn't going to be easy. The Mafia wasn't a bunch of street punks. They were organized, well-funded, and ruthless. But that didn't matter. Not in Harlem, not in his world. And if anyone thought Bumpy Johnson was going to let a group of Italians take his city, they had another thing coming. The game was changing. But Bumpy had been playing it his whole life. And tonight, the streets would bear witness to the first strike in a war that would define the rest of his reign. Bumpy Johnson had come a long way from his humble beginnings. Born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, he arrived in Harlem in the early 1920s, a young man looking to survive in the urban jungle of New York City. He had no family, no connections, just raw ambition and the skills to navigate a world built on power, loyalty, and street smarts. By the mid-1920s, Bumpy had found his place in Harlem's criminal underworld, and from there, he built an empire. But Bumpy wasn't like other street bosses. He didn't rely solely on muscle or fear. He ruled with something even more powerful: respect. He understood the game better than anyone. He knew how to make deals, how to build networks, and how to keep loyalty in check. In Harlem, men looked to him not just as a boss, but as a protector, someone who kept the peace and ensured everyone had a place in the system. By 1926, Bumpy's name was synonymous with power in Harlem. His numbers racket was the most profitable in the city, and his influence stretched far beyond the streets. He had earned the trust of the local politicians, the beat cops, and the everyday hustlers who worked under his watch. The city had become his kingdom. Harlem wasn't just a place, it was his world. And in it, Bumpy was king. But the streets, as always, were dangerous. The political climate in New York was shifting. The Italian Mafia, who had established themselves in the lower parts of the city, were growing more powerful. They were smart, savvy, and well-funded by their European connections. In the early years, their ambitions had been confined to areas like Little Italy and parts of downtown Manhattan, but now, in 1926, they were setting their sights on the heart of Harlem, the heart of Bumpy's empire. The Italian Mafia was a well-oiled machine, led by men who knew how to manipulate their way into power. They were patient, ruthless, and willing to do whatever it took to expand their reach. And Bumpy Johnson was standing in their way. He had long been the unchallenged ruler of Harlem, but he knew the Mafia was different. They weren't like the other street gangs and rival crews that had challenged him before. This time, Bumpy faced an opponent who could match his strategic mind, one who had resources that went beyond anything Bumpy could muster alone. In the background of Harlem's rise, the tension between Bumpy and the Italian Mafia had been brewing. The Mafia had long envied the hold Bumpy had on Harlem's criminal enterprises. They knew the key to conquering the city lay in taking him out. But Bumpy wasn't some gangster who could be bought off or pushed aside. He had built his empire on loyalty, and his reputation was a weapon as sharp as any gun. But even the most powerful kings could be challenged. The stakes were higher now than ever before. The Italians had money. They had muscle. But Bumpy had something else. The streets of Harlem themselves. He had fought for his position, and he wasn't about to let anyone, especially not the Mafia, take it from him without a fight. The world was changing, but Bumpy knew one thing for sure. The only way to stay at the top was to outsmart those who were coming for you. The Italian Mafia might have made their move, but they had no idea what they were walking into. Bumpy's men had begun to report strange movements around the city. Groups of Italians talking to his crew members, men who had been working for Bumpy for years. The Mafia had made their first play by infiltrating Bumpy's ranks, sowing seeds of doubt and promising riches beyond what Bumpy could offer. But the more Bumpy heard about it, the more it became clear. This wasn't just about territory, it was about loyalty, about a new wave of power that was trying to swallow up what Bumpy had built. The first real challenge came one late afternoon when one of Bumpy's trusted lieutenants, a man named Al, came to him with troubling news. Al had always been Bumpy's right hand, steady, reliable. But when Al walked into the office with a nervous look on his face, Bumpy knew something was wrong. "I've been hearing whispers, Bumpy," Al said, looking over his shoulder like someone might be listening. "The Italians. They've been talking to some of the boys. They're offering them something big." Bumpy's eyes narrowed. He knew what that meant. "What are they offering?" Al hesitated. "Money, power. They're promising a slice of the pie, more than we could ever give them, Bumpy." Bumpy stood up, his mind racing. This wasn't just about money, it was about control. The Italians were offering the kind of wealth and influence that even Bumpy's strongest men couldn't resist. He had always kept a tight grip on Harlem, but the Mafia's offers were like a siren's call, one that would be hard for even the most loyal of his men to ignore. "Let them come," Bumpy said, his voice calm, but every word weighed with authority. "We'll show them what happens when they try to take what's mine." As the days passed, Bumpy's preparations began. He knew it wasn't enough to rely solely on his own men. He would need allies, the kind of people who could move in the shadows and handle the job quickly, quietly. And when the time came, Bumpy would strike. He had no intention of letting the Mafia take Harlem. But deep down, Bumpy knew this wasn't just another street war. This was something bigger. The Mafia wasn't just a gang, they were an empire. And now, that empire was coming for him. The tension in Harlem had reached its boiling point. Bumpy Johnson, once untouchable, now found himself facing the full force of the Italian Mafia's ambitions. It wasn't just about the streets anymore. It was about control over everything Bumpy had worked for, everything he had built with his own hands. As the sun began to set one crisp evening, Bumpy's thoughts were interrupted by a familiar knock at the door of his office. He didn't need to say anything. He knew it was time. His men had gathered in the back room, the quiet hum of conversation giving way to the sharp tension in the air. Tonight would be the night they finally confronted the Italians head-on. There would be no more subtlety, no more waiting. This had gone on long enough. When Bumpy walked into the room, his men fell silent. They had all heard the rumors about the Mafia's growing influence, about the offers they had made to some of Bumpy's most trusted lieutenants. But now, it was time to take action. Bumpy's eyes scanned the faces of the men who had been with him since the beginning. Men who had never questioned his authority, who had followed him through thick and thin. "We've been hearing a lot of talk," Bumpy said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "The Italians think they can just walk in here and take over. They think they can buy our men and make deals behind our backs. But they've forgotten one thing. This is my city, my streets, and anyone who thinks otherwise is going to learn the hard way." His words were met with murmurs of agreement from his men, but Bumpy knew the reality of what he was asking them to do. This wasn't going to be easy. The Mafia wasn't a bunch of street thugs. They were an empire with resources and connections that reached far beyond New York. But Bumpy had built his own empire from the ground up, and he wasn't about to let it slip away without a fight. "You've all heard the rumors?" Bumpy continued, his tone now more serious. "And you've all seen the signs. The Italians are making their move, and they're using our own people against us. But what they don't understand is that loyalty goes both ways. We don't sell out our own, we don't back down, and we sure as hell don't let anyone take what's ours." Bumpy turned to one of his trusted men, a tough-as-nails enforcer named Leroy. "Leroy, get in touch with the others. We move tonight. No more delays." Leroy nodded, his face hardening with determination. "We'll make it happen, Bumpy." The room was now filled with an electric energy, the men preparing for the confrontation that was about to unfold. For Bumpy, this wasn't just about defending his turf, it was about making a stand. This was his empire, and he would be damned if anyone, especially the Mafia, would take it from him without a fight. As the men moved out into the streets, Bumpy couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The Mafia had underestimated him. They thought they could take Harlem, but they didn't understand how deeply rooted he was in the streets, how much loyalty he commanded. This wasn't just about muscle, it was about respect. And in Harlem, respect was everything. They made their way to the heart of the Italians' operation, a warehouse near the docks where several key Mafia figures were rumored to be meeting. Bumpy knew this would be a dangerous confrontation. He wasn't dealing with amateurs, but he had his own ace in the hole, the loyalty of his crew, men who had fought by his side for years, men who knew how to handle themselves when it came to business. When they reached the warehouse, the lights inside flickered. Bumpy could see the shadowed outlines of men moving through the windows. This was it. This was the moment. Bumpy stepped forward, his hand resting on the grip of his revolver. But it wasn't just the gun in his hand that made him dangerous. It was his calm, his confidence, the years of building an empire on the streets of Harlem. He had been through worse, and tonight he was ready to face the Mafia head on. He gestured for his men to spread out, moving in through the back entrance. As they entered, the sound of voices grew louder, and Bumpy's heart rate slowed. There was no turning back now. Inside, the scene was exactly as Bumpy had expected. The Italians, a mix of well-dressed men and hardened criminals, sat around a table, their conversation cut off when Bumpy's men burst in. There was a moment of stunned silence, then chaos erupted. Bumpy moved toward the head of the table, where the most prominent of the Mafia men, a man named Giovanni Johnny Salerno, sat. Salerno was no stranger to Bumpy. They had crossed paths before, in smaller matters, but tonight there would be no negotiation, no handshake. This was war. "You thought you could walk into my city, Johnny?" Bumpy said, his voice booming through the room. "You thought you could buy off my men, take my streets, and I wouldn't do anything about it?" Salerno stood up, his face a mix of surprise and disbelief. "Bumpy, this is business. You should have stayed out of it. You can't stop progress." "Progress?" Bumpy spat, his gaze hardening. "Progress is built on loyalty, and you don't understand loyalty. You never did. You come into my city with your money, your deals, and think you can take what's mine. Well, I'm here to tell you, you're not welcome here." Bumpy's men moved in, the tension in the room escalating. The sound of gunmetal clicking and the shifting of bodies filled the air. Salerno's men, who had been expecting trouble, hesitated, but it was too late. Bumpy's men were faster, more organized. The first shot rang out, and in an instant, the room turned into a battlefield. Bumpy moved through the chaos like a man who had been born into it. His movements were precise, controlled. He didn't need to be the fastest or the strongest, he just needed to be the smartest. And he knew how to play the game better than anyone else in the room. Salerno, realizing that the tide had turned, tried to make a break for it, but Bumpy was faster. He grabbed the Mafia boss by the arm, slamming him against the wall. "This is my city, Johnny," Bumpy growled, his breath hot with anger. "And you'll never take it from me." The aftermath of the clash was swift. The Mafia's presence in Harlem was no longer a threat. Bumpy had shown them what happened when they tried to make a move on his turf. It wasn't just about fighting, it was about making sure everyone understood that Harlem belonged to him, and anyone who thought otherwise would learn the hard way. Word spread quickly that Bumpy Johnson had once again proven that his name was synonymous with power. The Mafia may have had money, may have had muscle, but Bumpy had something far more dangerous, an unwavering loyalty to the streets that no one could take from him. For Bumpy, this victory wasn't just about defending his empire. It was about sending a message. He wasn't just fighting for Harlem, he was fighting for respect. And in the underworld, respect was everything. The aftermath of the battle at the warehouse reverberated through Harlem like the echo of a gunshot. In the days that followed, whispers turned into stories. Stories of how Bumpy Johnson had single-handedly forced the Italian Mafia to retreat, sending a clear message that Harlem was not for sale. The men who had worked for him, the community he had fought to protect, all saw it. Bumpy's empire was still intact. The streets were still his. Bumpy's victory over the Mafia was more than just a tactical win. It was a reaffirmation of his status as the king of Harlem. The Italian Mafia, with their power, money, and connections, had tried to pull him down, but they had underestimated him. Bumpy's strength wasn't just in his ability to fight, it was in his understanding of the streets, the loyalty he commanded, and his ironclad will to never let anyone take what he had worked so hard to build. The Mafia's retreat was swift but decisive. They had tested Bumpy, and they had learned that in Harlem there was no room for outsiders trying to push him around.
The message wasn't just for the Mafia,
it was for anyone who might think that Harlem's throne was up for grabs. Bumpy Johnson had fought for his position, and he wasn't about to let anyone, not even the most powerful criminal syndicate in the world, take it from him. In the weeks that followed, Harlem's underworld returned to its usual rhythm, but the events of that night had changed everything. The Mafia, who had thought they could expand their influence into the heart of Bumpy's empire, now knew better. And those who had been wavering, men who had looked to the Mafia for something more, began to see the truth. Bumpy wasn't just a gangster, he was the embodiment of the streets. He knew how to survive, how to lead, and how to make sure no one ever challenged his authority again. Bumpy's reputation in Harlem reached new heights. He wasn't just feared, he was respected, more than ever before. The men who worked for him knew that crossing him meant facing the consequences. The streets respected strength, but they also respected loyalty. And Bumpy had both in abundance. It wasn't just his toughness that made him legendary, it was his ability to read people, to play the game of power better than anyone else. He wasn't just the man who ran the numbers game. He was the man who understood the true currency of the streets, loyalty. And that loyalty, once earned, was something that even the Mafia couldn't break. For Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was a symbol of resilience. He had survived countless battles, faced down betrayal, and come out on top each time. The Italians had learned the hard way that Harlem didn't belong to them. It belonged to the man who had built it from the ground up, piece by piece, with the sweat and blood of his crew. Bumpy Johnson's war with the Italian Mafia in 1926 wasn't just about a man defending his turf, it was about defending everything he had built. The streets of Harlem, a place where loyalty was the foundation of survival, had become the battleground for something far more significant: the battle for respect. In the world Bumpy lived in, power wasn't just about strength or money, it was about the ability to inspire loyalty, to command respect, and to make sure no one could ever take that from you. The Mafia,
for all their influence and wealth,
couldn't buy what Bumpy had. And in that moment, Bumpy reminded the world what it meant to be untouchable. His victory wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a statement. The streets of Harlem had their king, and his name was Bumpy Johnson. The Italians had learned that lesson the hard way, and so had every other would-be challenger who thought they could take what belonged to him. Bumpy's empire, built on loyalty and respect, stood firm against the tides of change. The story of his war with the Mafia became a legend in itself, a story of a man who knew that in the streets there was only room for one king. And for Bumpy Johnson, that king was always going to be him. In the end, Bumpy's legacy was never about how much power he held. It was about how he held on to it. In a world full of betrayal and shifting allegiances, Bumpy had shown the world what it took to survive, to thrive, and to remain untouchable. This wasn't just about a gangster fighting to keep his turf. It was about a king holding on to his throne, no matter who came knocking at the gates. And in the end, Bumpy Johnson's reign over Harlem would be remembered as one of the most legendary stories ever told in the underworld. Bumpy Johnson didn't just win a battle, he built a legacy that would echo through the streets of Harlem for generations. His story wasn't just about survival, it was about understanding the game better than anyone else, and never letting go of what was his. Bumpy Johnson's war with the Italian Mafia in 1926 was more than just a fight for territory. It was a fight for the very soul of Harlem. It was a battle that echoed through the streets, shaking the foundations of the criminal underworld and reinforcing the idea that in the world of power, loyalty and respect were the true currencies that determined who could rule and who would fall. For the Mafia, Harlem was a prize to be taken, a city filled with opportunity, wealth, and influence. But for Bumpy, Harlem was more than a city. It was his home, his kingdom, and his legacy. It was where he had built his empire from the ground up, and no outsider was going to waltz in and take it from him without facing the consequences. When the Mafia tried to infiltrate his turf, they underestimated the loyalty Bumpy had earned and the power he had accumulated through years of hard work and respect. They thought they could buy their way in, but they didn't understand the streets the way Bumpy did. Bumpy's victory wasn't just about survival, it was about reminding everyone who the real king of Harlem was. He fought not just with his fists, but with his mind, understanding that in the end, power in the streets wasn't about who had the most muscle, it was about who commanded respect. And Bumpy Johnson had earned that respect in ways no one could ever take from him. The fall of the Mafia's ambitions in Harlem was more than just a personal win for Bumpy. It was a statement that reverberated through the criminal world. No one, not even the most powerful syndicate in the country, could take what belonged to him. Harlem was his, and the price of trying to take it would always be too high. As time passed, the legend of Bumpy Johnson only grew stronger. His name became synonymous with power, resilience, and unwavering loyalty to the streets that had shaped him. But his story wasn't just about the battles he fought or the empire he built. It was about the way he held on to his legacy, no matter how hard the world tried to take it from him. This wasn't just about one man's pride, it was about the dignity of a community that had been built on the foundation of respect. Bumpy Johnson's story was one of survival, yes, but it was also one of understanding the true nature of power. The streets were a world full of betrayal, alliances, and shifting loyalties. But Bumpy proved that there was one thing that could never be taken away: the legacy of a man who knew how to stand tall, no matter the odds. In the end, Bumpy Johnson's greatest victory wasn't just in his ability to fight. It was in his ability to hold on to what was his, to remind the world that no matter how hard they tried, no one could ever take Harlem from him. His name would echo in the streets, a reminder to all that in the game of power, respect is everything, and that a king who knows how to keep his crown is a legend that will never fade. This wasn't just a story of survival. It was about standing your ground in the face of betrayal and making sure that the world never forgets who you are. Bumpy Johnson's legacy wasn't just built on muscle, it was built on loyalty, respect, and the unyielding strength to defend what was rightfully his. And in the end, that's what made him a legend.